All stories posted on our channel are stories from our subscribers and created by us based on real events we've experienced and witnessed. We post new stories every day for your entertainment, that we hope you enjoy them. Thank you.
Thanksgiving dinner at my in-laws' house in Greenwich, Connecticut was always an exercise in endurance. For 11 years, I'd sat at their mahogany table, eaten their catered turkey, and listened to their subtle and not-so-subtle reminders that I wasn't good enough for their daughter. The Ashford family had money, old money, the kind that came with trust funds and Ivy League legacies, and an unshakable conviction that everyone outside their circle was somehow lesser. I was definitely lesser in their eyes. My name is Wyatt Brennan, and on paper I was exactly what they'd feared when their daughter brought me home from a charity event 12 years ago. A man without pedigree. No trust fund, no family connections, no prestigious surname. I'd grown up in a trailer park in Bakersfield, California, worked my way through community college, and eventually landed a job as a software developer at a small startup in San Jose. That startup was called Next Gen Analytics. But I'll get to that part later. What the Ashfords saw was a man who drove a 12-year-old Honda Accord, wore clothes from Target, and worked from a home office in the modest ranch house we'd bought in Stamford 7 years ago. What they didn't see, what nobody saw, was the other side of the balance sheet, by choice. But that Thanksgiving, everything changed. The trouble started during cocktail hour, before we'd even sat down to eat. My wife, Colette, was standing by the fireplace with her mother, Vivienne, and her sister, Marguerite, their voices carrying across the room in that particular way that suggested they wanted me to hear. "He's still working at that little company?" Marguerite was saying. "It's been, what, 8 years?" "9," Vivienne corrected. 9 years in the same position. No advancement, no ambition. Just sitting in that office, tapping away at his computer. "At least he's employed," Colette said, but there was no defense in her voice, just resignation. Some men can't even manage that. I pretended to be fascinated by the books on Harrison Ashford's study shelves, though I'd memorized their spines years ago. The conversation wasn't new, just louder than usual, less careful about being overheard. My father-in-law approached me with a tumbler of scotch he knew I wouldn't drink. Harrison was a retired investment banker, the kind of man who measured human worth in portfolio performance and country club memberships. He'd never forgiven his daughter for marrying beneath her station. "Wyatt," he handed me the glass. "Colette tells me you're still at that software company. Any plans to move into something more substantial?" "I'm happy where I am." Happy. He said the word like it was a foreign concept. "I suppose happiness is enough for some people. Others prefer success. I'd learned over the years not to rise to the bait. Arguing with Harrison only gave him ammunition. So I nodded, sipped the scotch I didn't want, and waited for dinner to begin. But dinner was worse. The table seated 14 people that year. The core Ashford family, some cousins from Boston, and me, the perpetual outsider. Colette sat across from me rather than beside me, a seating arrangement I'd noticed becoming more common at family gatherings. The conversation flowed around me without including me. Business deals and stock performances, summer plans for the Nantucket house. Marguerite's husband, a hedge fund manager named Tristan, held court about some acquisition his firm had orchestrated. 23 million in the first quarter alone, he was saying. "The partners are talking about making me senior VP by spring." "Wonderful news," Harrison said, beaming at his son-in-law in a way he'd never once looked at me. "That's what hard work looks like, children. That's what success looks like." His eyes slid to me, the comparison implicit. I said nothing. I'd learned that silence was safer. But Colette, apparently, had decided silence wasn't enough anymore. "Wyatt's company did have some news recently," she said, and something in her tone made me look up. "Didn't they, Wyatt?" "Some restructuring," I said carefully. "Restructuring." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's what we're calling it. His company was bought out by some tech conglomerate. Half the staff was let go." "But not Wyatt?" Harrison asked. "Oh, Wyatt's still there. same position, same salary. While everyone around him was getting severance packages and moving on to bigger things, my husband just stayed. She took a long drink of wine. Like furniture, too boring to notice, too useless to promote. The table had gone quiet. Even Marguerite looked uncomfortable. "Colette," I said quietly. "What? It's true, isn't it? 9 years, Wyatt. 9 years at the same job, making the same money, while I've had to pretend to my family that we're something we're not." She gestured at the room around us. "Do you know how embarrassing it is? Watching Marguerite and Tristan buy their brownstone in the city while we're still in that little house. Watching everyone move forward while you just sit there." "I think that's enough," I said, my voice still measured. "Do you? Well, I don't think it's nearly enough." The wine had loosened something in her, or maybe this had been building for years, and the wine just gave her permission. "I've carried us for the entire marriage, Wyatt. My family's connections, my social capital, my ability to make excuses for why my husband can't afford to take me anywhere decent. And what do I get in return? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Colette, you know what? If you're so content with your mediocre little life, maybe you should go live in the streets. See how your happiness serves you then." She slammed her wineglass down hard enough to rattle the silverware. "Go. Live in the streets. That's probably what you deserve anyway." The silence that followed was absolute. I looked around the table, at the Ashfords with their careful expressions of distaste, at Tristan trying not to smirk, at Marguerite's performative sympathy. I looked at my wife, her face flushed with wine and years of accumulated resentment, and I made a decision. "All right," I said. Colette blinked. "What? All right, I'll go." I stood up, folded my napkin and placed it beside my untouched plate. "I'll go live in the streets, as you suggested, or at least I'll stop pretending this is a marriage worth saving." "Wyatt, I didn't mean—" "You meant exactly what you said. You've been meaning it for years. You just finally found the courage to say it out loud." I looked at Harrison, at Vivian, at the family that had never accepted me. "Thank you for dinner and for the clarity." I walked out of that dining room, through the marble foyer and into the cold November night. My coat was still inside. I didn't go back for it. Colette caught up with me at the car. "Wyatt, stop. You're being dramatic." "I'm being honest. There's a difference. You can't just leave. We have to talk about this." "No, Colette, we don't." I unlocked the Honda, the 12-year-old car she'd always been embarrassed by. "You just told me, in front of your entire family, that I should go live in the streets, that our marriage has been nothing but a burden to you. What's left to talk about?" I was upset. I said things I didn't mean. "You meant every word. The wine just made you brave enough to say them." I got into the car. "I'll be at the house for a few more days, getting my things. After that, you won't have to be embarrassed by me anymore." I drove away before she could respond. In the rearview mirror, I watched her standing in her parents' driveway, her designer dress inadequate against the cold, her expression shifting from anger to something that might have been shock. She didn't know yet. None of them knew. But they would. Soon enough, they would. The thing about Next-Gen Analytics is that it wasn't always called Next-Gen Analytics. When I joined the company in 2015, it was a struggling startup called DataPulse, operating out of a converted warehouse in San Jose, with funding that barely covered payroll. There were 8 of us then, 5 developers, 2 data scientists, and a CEO named Leonard Hoffman, who believed he'd created something revolutionary. He had. We all had. DataPulse had developed a machine learning algorithm that could predict consumer behavior with unprecedented accuracy. While other companies were still relying on demographic data and surveys, we were mapping neural pathways of decision-making, understanding not just what people bought, but why they bought it and what they would buy next. I wasn't just a developer. I was one of the 3 people who'd built the core algorithm. My name is on 3 patents that generate more licensing revenue than most people earn in a lifetime. But here's the thing. I never told Colette any of that. It started as practicality. When we first met, DataPulse was still hemorrhaging money. Leonard was paying us partly in salary and partly in equity, promises of future value that might never materialize. I didn't want to seem like a dreamer, chasing startup lottery tickets while asking a woman to build a life with me. So I told her I worked in software development, which was true, just incomplete. By the time Datapulse started succeeding, by the time we'd been acquired by NextGen, a tech conglomerate that paid $800 million for our technology, Colette and I had been married for 4 years, and I'd begun to notice things, the way she deferred to her family's opinions about me, the subtle put-downs disguised as jokes, the growing distance between who she presented to the world and who she was at home, when there was no audience to impress. I started wondering, if she found out about the money, would things change? Would she suddenly become loving, attentive, proud of her husband? Or would she just add wealthy to her list of social assets, something to brag about at charity events? I needed to know who I'd married, so I kept the secret. The acquisition had made me wealthy beyond anything I'd imagined. My equity stake was worth $47 million before taxes. After taxes, after legal fees, after setting up the necessary structures to protect and grow the money, I had approximately $28 million in assets. But I kept living like I always had. The Honda Accord stayed in the driveway. The house in Stamford stayed modest. My clothes stayed unremarkable. I worked from home, contributing to NextGen's projects, drawing a reasonable salary, and watching my actual wealth accumulate in accounts and investments that nobody knew about. Not nobody. My lawyer knew. My accountant knew. Leonard Hoffman knew, because he'd helped me structure the arrangement when I told him I wanted to keep it quiet. Family stuff, I'd explained. I need to figure some things out before I change anything. Leonard had understood. He'd gone through his own divorce, his own realization that some people love you differently when you're worth millions than when you're worth nothing. Take all the time you need, he'd said. The money will still be there when you're ready. So for 7 years, I'd lived 2 lives. The underachiever my in-laws despised, and the millionaire nobody suspected. I'd watched Colette's frustration grow, her contempt become more visible, her disappointment more vocal. And I'd waited. For what? I wasn't sure. Maybe for her to love me anyway. Maybe for some sign that the money wouldn't matter, that she'd choose the man over the portfolio. But Thanksgiving had answered that question definitively. The night I left the Ashfords' house, I drove to a hotel in New Haven rather than going home. I needed space to think, to process what had happened and decide what came next. The room was a standard business suite. Nothing fancy, the kind of place that matched the image I'd cultivated. I sat on the bed, still in my dinner clothes, and stared at the wall for a long time. 11 years of marriage, 11 years of being told in ways subtle and overt that I wasn't enough, that my job was embarrassing, my car was embarrassing, my lack of ambition was embarrassing, that Colette had sacrificed her potential by settling for me, and through all of it, I'd been worth more than her entire family combined. Harrison Ashford, with his investment banking legacy and his Greenwich estate, was worth approximately $15 million by my estimate. Tristan, the hedge fund wunderkind, had just celebrated earning $23 million in a quarter, not for himself, but for his firm. His personal take was maybe 1/10 of that. Meanwhile, I'd been sitting at their table, absorbing their contempt, while my net worth exceeded all of theirs put together. Why had I done it? Why had I accepted the humiliation? The answer was complicated. Part of it was the experiment, wanting to see who Colette really was, who her family really was, when they thought I had nothing to offer. Part of it was my own baggage from growing up poor, some internalized belief that maybe they were right, that money couldn't change who I fundamentally was. But part of it, I realized that night in the hotel room, was cowardice. I'd been afraid to confront the truth, afraid that if I revealed my wealth, Colette would suddenly become loving, and I'd never know if she actually loved me or just my bank account, afraid that nothing would change, that she'd take my money and continue to treat me with the same contempt. I'd hidden behind the secret because the secret was safer than the truth, but safe wasn't working anymore. Safe had ended with my wife telling me to live in the streets. It was time to stop hiding. The Monday after Thanksgiving, I drove to Manhattan to meet with Gideon Strauss. Gideon was a family law attorney who specialized in high net worth divorces, the kind where the assets were complicated, the stakes were enormous, and discretion was paramount. I'd found him through Leonard's recommendation years ago, during the period when I was first coming to terms with my wealth and trying to understand what it meant for my marriage. At the time, I hadn't been ready to use his services. Now I was. His office was in a glass tower on 6th Avenue, the waiting room all sleek furniture and abstract art. His assistant offered me coffee, water, sparkling water, tea, a whole menu of beverages designed to signal that clients here were accustomed to choice. Gideon himself was in his 60s, silver-haired, with the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen every possible configuration of marital dissolution. He shook my hand warmly, gestured to a leather chair across from his desk, and listened without interrupting while I told him everything. The secret wealth, the Ashford contempt, the Thanksgiving confrontation, my decision to finally end a marriage that had been dying for years. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "This is going to be complicated," he said finally. "Not legally. Legally, it's actually fairly straightforward. You accumulated most of your wealth before the marriage, and even the post-marital appreciation was derived from pre-marital assets. Connecticut is an equitable distribution state, but equitable doesn't mean equal. Given the circumstances, we can make a strong argument for keeping the bulk of your assets separate. Then what's complicated? The human part." He leaned forward. "Your wife, and more importantly her family, has spent 11 years believing you were financially insignificant. When they discover the truth, there will be anger, wounded pride, attempts to retaliate through any means available." "What means?" "Claims that you defrauded her by concealing assets. Arguments that the prenuptial agreement was invalid because she didn't know your true financial situation when she signed it." "There is no prenuptial agreement." Gideon's eyebrows rose. "No prenup? Colette's family suggested one before the wedding. Very aggressively suggested one, actually. But she refused. Said it would be insulting, since I clearly didn't have anything worth protecting. And you went along with that. At the time, they were right. I was a startup employee making a modest salary. The equity was worthless on paper. A prenup would have been meaningless. But now the situation is different. But the lack of prenup actually works in my favor, doesn't it? I didn't conceal anything through a legal agreement. I just didn't volunteer information." Gideon considered this. "That's one way to frame it. Her attorneys will argue that the omission itself was fraudulent, that if she'd known about your wealth, she would have behaved differently. She definitely would have behaved differently. That's exactly why I didn't tell her. You understand that sounds damaging, right? That it sounds like you were deliberately deceiving your wife." "I was deliberately testing my wife. There's a difference." I stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the Manhattan skyline. "Gideon, I grew up with nothing, less than nothing. I watched people treat my family like garbage because we didn't have money, and then I watched some of those same people become suddenly friendly when they thought we might have something to offer." "So you wanted to see how Colette's family would treat you without the wealth?" "I wanted to see how Colette would treat me, and now I know." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I understand. And for what it's worth, I think a judge might understand too, at least partially. The question is how much of your assets you're willing to lose for the satisfaction of proving a point. How much could I lose? Worst case, if she can prove concealment of assets during the marriage, possibly 50% of everything accumulated after the wedding. That's potentially millions of dollars." He pulled out a legal pad. "Best case, she gets a modest settlement, alimony for a limited period, maybe some portion of the marital home equity. We keep everything else intact." "And the most likely case?" Somewhere in between. But given the circumstances, the public humiliation, the documented pattern of contempt, the lack of prenup that she herself insisted on, I think we're looking at the better end of that spectrum. I turned back to face him. Then let's proceed. You're certain there's no possibility of reconciliation? She told me to live in the streets, in front of her entire family, on Thanksgiving. Gideon nodded slowly. Then let's proceed. I gave Colette 2 weeks to realize what she'd done. During that time, I stayed at the hotel in New Haven, communicated only through brief texts about practical matters, and began the process of disentangling my life from hers. I didn't mention the divorce papers being prepared. I didn't hint at the financial revelations to come. I just waited. She called me 6 times that first week, left voicemails that ranged from angry to apologetic to demanding. Wyatt, this is ridiculous. You can't just walk out on our marriage over a disagreement at dinner. I said things I didn't mean. I was frustrated. You know how my family gets under my skin. If you think giving me the silent treatment is going to change anything, you're wrong. Call me. We need to talk about this like adults. I didn't call back. The second week, her tone shifted. The voicemails became shorter, more uncertain. She started asking questions instead of making demands. Where are you staying? Your secretary said you're not at work. I talked to my attorney, just to understand our options. You should probably talk to someone too. Wyatt, please, whatever you're planning, just tell me. The mention of an attorney told me she was starting to take this seriously. Good. I wanted her prepared for what was coming, not because I cared about her feelings, that ship had sailed at Thanksgiving, but because I wanted her to understand that this wasn't an impulsive reaction. This was a deliberate choice, made with full awareness of the consequences. On day 14, I called her. We need to meet, I said when she answered. I'll be at the house tomorrow at 2 o'clock. The house? You're coming home. I'm coming to talk. That's not the same thing. Wyatt? 2 o'clock. Please make sure you're there alone. I arrived at the Stamford house at exactly 2 p.m., carrying a briefcase that contained documents Gideon had prepared. Colette was waiting in the living room, dressed more carefully than usual for a Saturday afternoon. She'd done her hair, put on makeup, chosen an outfit that probably cost more than our monthly mortgage payment. She looked like she was preparing for a negotiation, which, in a way, she was. Wyatt! She stood as I entered. Thank you for coming. Let's sit down. We took opposite ends of the couch, a physical distance that matched the emotional one. She was nervous. I could see it in the way she kept clasping and unclasping her hands. I've had time to think, she said before I could speak, about Thanksgiving, about what I said. I was wrong to humiliate you like that, especially in front of my family. You were. I've been frustrated. Our marriage hasn't been what I wanted it to be, and instead of talking to you about it, I let it build up until I exploded. She reached toward me, then pulled back. But that doesn't mean our marriage is over. We can work on this. We can get counseling, figure out what we both need. I know what I need. What? I opened the briefcase and pulled out the first document. I need you to understand something about me, something I should have told you years ago. What are you... I handed her a financial statement. Not the complete picture, but enough to start. She looked at the paper, confused at first, then increasingly bewildered. What is this? That's a summary of my investment portfolio. As of last month, her eyes found the total. I watched her face as the number registered, watched the confusion transform into disbelief, then denial, then something that looked like vertigo. This says $8 million. That's one account. There are others. Wyatt, this isn't funny. If you're trying to make some kind of point, I handed her another document, then another. Bank statements, brokerage accounts, real estate holdings, patent royalty income, the complete architecture of a fortune she'd never suspected. $28 million, I said, give or take, depending on market conditions. That's what I'm worth. Colette was staring at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. I don't understand. How is this possible? Next Gen Analytics, the company that bought DataPulse. I was one of the original founders, Colette. I helped create the technology they acquired. My equity stake was worth 47 million before taxes. But you told me, I told you I worked in software development. That was true. You said you were just a programmer. I said a lot of things that were technically accurate but deliberately incomplete. I sat back, watching her process. I wanted to see who you really were, who your family really was, what you actually thought of me when you believed I had nothing to offer. You've been lying to me for our entire marriage. I've been testing you, and you failed. The color drained from her face. Testing me? 11 years, Colette. 11 years of your family's contempt, of your disappointment, of being told I wasn't ambitious enough, successful enough, wealthy enough. And the whole time I was worth more than all of you combined. I stood up. That's what I needed you to know before we proceed. Proceed with what? I pulled out the last document in the briefcase, the divorce petition. Proceed with this. Colette didn't take the news well. For the first several minutes after I handed her the divorce papers, she just sat there, staring at them without really seeing. The documents were trembling in her hands, or rather her hands were trembling, making the papers shake. You can't be serious, she finally said. I'm completely serious. You're filing for divorce after 11 years of marriage because of one argument at Thanksgiving? Not because of one argument, because of 11 years of disrespect that culminated in you telling me to live in the streets. I was upset. I said something I didn't mean. You meant every word. The only thing that's changed is now you know I'm wealthy, and suddenly that makes me worth fighting for. That's not fair, isn't it? I walked to the window, looking out at the modest backyard we'd shared for 7 years. Let me ask you something, Colette. If I told you about the money when we first got together, if you'd known from the beginning that I was going to be worth millions, would you have treated me the same way? She was quiet for a long moment. Then, I don't know. Yes, you do, and so do I. You would have defended me to your family. You would have been proud of me. You would have looked at me the way you look at Tristan, with respect and admiration. I turned back to face her. The only thing different about me now is what's in my bank account. If that changes how you feel, then your feelings were never about me at all. That's not... She stood up abruptly. You don't get to do this. You don't get to lie to me for 11 years and then blame me for not treating you well enough. I didn't lie. I omitted. Same thing. It's not the same thing at all. I never told you I was poor. I never complained about money or asked you for financial help. I just didn't volunteer that I was rich. And you and your family drew your own conclusions. Conclusions you encouraged. Conclusions you wanted to draw. Because it confirmed what you already believed, that I was beneath you, that you'd married down, that you were doing me a favor by staying. Colette's face was flushed now, her composure cracking. You have no idea what our marriage has been like for me. Watching my sister with Tristan, watching them move into their brownstone while we stayed in this, she gestured at the house around us. This perfectly nice house in a perfectly nice neighborhood that you could have upgraded at any time if you'd bothered to ask what I could actually afford. How was I supposed to know to ask? You could have asked anyway. You could have said, Wyatt, what are our real financial options? What can we actually afford? But you never did. You just assumed you knew everything about me. She sat back down heavily. I want my lawyer. Of course you do. Don't, she held up a hand. Don't condescend to me right now. You've been manipulating me for over a decade. You don't get to act like you're the victim here. I'm not acting like a victim. I'm acting like someone who finally has clarity about his marriage. Clarity, she laughed bitterly. You had clarity the whole time. You knew exactly what you were doing, exactly what you were hiding. I'm the one who was in the dark, and now you're not. Now you have all the information. I picked up my briefcase. My attorney's contact information is in the papers. He'll be in touch about next steps. Where are you going? Back to my hotel. Now the same hotel you've been staying at for 2 weeks, while I was home alone, worried sick, thinking our marriage might be over? It was over long before Thanksgiving, Colette. You just didn't notice because you were too busy being disappointed in me. I walked to the door. Her voice stopped me. Wyatt. I turned. Did you ever love me? Or was I always just an experiment? The question deserved a real answer. I thought about the early years, when things had been good, or at least when I'd believed they were good. The way she'd laughed at my jokes, the plans we'd made together, the moments that had seemed at the time like the foundation of something real. "I loved who I thought you were," I said. "I'm not sure that person ever existed." I left before she could respond. The Ashford family found out 3 days later. I know this because Gideon received a call from Colette's attorney, a high-powered divorce specialist named Cordelia Vance, demanding an emergency meeting. The tone, Gideon reported, was somewhere between outraged and incredulous. "They don't believe it," he said when he called to update me. "Her attorney is claiming the financial statements must be fraudulent, that no one could conceal that much wealth from a spouse for that long. Let them believe what they want. The documents are real and they're verifiable." Oh, they'll verify, and when they do, the strategy will shift. Right now they're in denial. Soon they'll be in negotiation mode. What kind of negotiation? She's going to want a significant portion of your assets. She's going to argue that the concealment itself justifies an unequal division in her favor. And how likely is she to succeed? Honestly, moderately. Connecticut courts don't love deception, even deception that doesn't technically violate any laws. A sympathetic judge might award her more than the standard calculation would suggest. He paused. But there's a countervailing factor, which is the Thanksgiving incident. Witnesses, her entire family, heard her tell you to live in the streets. They heard her publicly humiliate you, call you worthless, essentially terminate the marriage herself. That's powerful mitigation. So it comes down to who the judge sympathizes with more. In these cases, it often does, which is why we need to be strategic about how we present your story. The meeting happened a week later. In a conference room at Cordelia Vance's Midtown office. Colette was there with her attorney. I was there with Gideon. And surprisingly, though I should have expected it, Harrison and Vivian Ashford were there too. They weren't supposed to be involved in the legal proceedings, but they'd insisted on attending, probably to protect the family reputation, or what was left of it. Harrison looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between fury and grudging reassessment. For 11 years, he'd dismissed me as insignificant. Now, he was sitting across from someone who could buy and sell his entire estate without noticing the expense. "This is fraud," he said before anyone else could speak. "Outright fraud. My daughter was deceived into a marriage under false pretenses." "With respect, Mr. Ashford," Gideon said smoothly, "your daughter wasn't deceived into anything. There was no prenuptial agreement, at her insistence, I might add. And Mr. Brennan made no false statements about his financial situation. He hid $28 million. He didn't volunteer information that no one asked for. That's not the same as hiding." Cordelia Vance held up a hand. "Let's focus on the matter at hand. My client is seeking an equitable division of marital assets, as well as substantial alimony, given the length of the marriage and the disparity in disclosed income." "What disparity?" Gideon asked. "Mrs. Brennan has been employed throughout the marriage at a salary equivalent to her husband's disclosed income. She's made no career sacrifices, supported no one through professional hardship. She supported a marriage she believed was with a middle-class software developer, not a secret millionaire. And how, exactly, does that change anything? She lived in the same house, drove the same car, enjoyed the same lifestyle, regardless of Mr. Brennan's actual net worth. She wasn't harmed by the omission. She just wasn't benefited by it." Colette spoke for the first time. "I was humiliated. My entire family was humiliated. Your family humiliated themselves," I said, "by treating me with contempt for 11 years based on assumptions about my worth, assumptions that turned out to be wrong. We treated you according to what we knew. You treated me according to what you believed. That's different." I leaned forward. "Let me ask you something, Harrison. If I'd shown up at that Thanksgiving dinner in a Bentley, wearing a Rolex, bragging about my investment portfolio, would Colette have told me to live in the streets?" Harrison's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. "That's what I thought." The meeting ended without resolution, which Gideon said was expected. "First meetings are about establishing positions," he explained as we walked back to his office. They're testing our resolve, seeing how much they can get. The real negotiations will come later. What are our options? Several. We can fight this through the courts, which will be expensive and time-consuming, but might result in the best outcome for you financially. Or we can negotiate a settlement that's higher than we'd like, but gets you out quickly and cleanly. And the third option? Gideon smiled slightly. The third option is unconventional, but it might be effective given the circumstances. I'm listening. We go public. I stopped walking. Public how? The story of your marriage is unusual, to say the least. A wealthy man who concealed his assets to test his wife's character, who endured years of contempt before finally walking away. It's the kind of narrative that captures public attention. You want me to talk to the press. I want you to consider it. The Ashford family values their reputation above almost everything else. If the story became public, if the world knew that Harrison Ashford's daughter married a millionaire and spent a decade treating him like garbage, it would be deeply damaging to their social standing. And you think that leverage would bring them to the table? I think it would accelerate negotiations significantly. I considered this. There was a certain appeal to it, the idea of the Ashfords facing public accountability for their treatment of me. But there was also something distasteful about using the media as a weapon. Let me think about it. Of course, there's no rush. The legal process will take months regardless. We have time to strategize. I spent the next week thinking, not just about the divorce strategy, but about everything. About who I'd been in the marriage, who I'd become outside of it, and who I wanted to be going forward. The wealth had always been abstract to me. I'd earned it, yes, but I'd never really used it. I drove my old car, lived in my modest house, wore my unremarkable clothes. The money had been more like potential energy, stored, waiting, never actually converted into kinetic motion. Maybe that had been part of the test too. Maybe I'd been afraid that if I started living like a wealthy man, I'd lose whatever it was about myself that I actually valued, that I'd become like the Ashfords, defined by what I owned rather than who I was. But hiding from wealth wasn't any better than being consumed by it. Both were forms of avoidance, ways of refusing to integrate this massive change into my identity. I was 41 years old. I had more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, and I was still living like the kid from the Bakersfield trailer park, terrified that someone would discover I didn't belong. It was time to stop hiding. I called Leonard Hoffman that weekend. "Wyatt, how are you holding up?" "Better than expected. I'm getting divorced." "I heard. I'm sorry." "Don't be. It's the right decision." I paused. "Leonard, I've been thinking about what comes next. After the divorce, after all of this is settled, I want to do something different with my life. Different how? I'm not sure yet. But I've spent 9 years at NextGen, most of them working on projects that didn't really matter to me. I want to find something that does." "Like what?" "That's what I need to figure out, but I thought you might have some ideas." Leonard was quiet for a moment. Then, "You know about the foundation I started? After I sold my stake in the company? The education initiative, teaching programming to kids in underserved communities?" "Right. We're always looking for technical advisors, people who can help develop curriculum, mentor students, that sort of thing. It's not full-time work, but it's meaningful." "That sounds like exactly what I need. Then come out to San Jose next month. I'll introduce you to the team. See if it's a fit." "I will. Thank you, Leonard." "Don't thank me yet. You might hate it." "I doubt that, but we'll see." The divorce negotiations took 4 months. Cordelia Vance fought hard for Colette, arguing that my concealment of assets justified a larger settlement than standard equitable distribution would suggest. Gideon countered that Colette had suffered no actual damages from the omission, that she'd lived the same lifestyle, regardless of my hidden wealth, and that her public humiliation of me at Thanksgiving demonstrated a pattern of contempt that far exceeded any deception on my part. In the end, we settled somewhere in the middle. Colette received $4.2 million, significantly more than she would have gotten in a standard divorce, but far less than the half she'd initially demanded. She also got the Stamford house, which she immediately put on the market. I kept everything else, the investment accounts, the patent royalties, the future earnings from my next-gen work. The day the settlement was finalized, I felt nothing like what I'd expected. I'd thought there would be satisfaction, vindication even, the wealthy man whose wife had dismissed him as worthless, finally revealing his true value and walking away with most of it intact. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like waste. 11 years of my life invested in a relationship that had been hollow from the start. A woman I'd loved who had never loved me back, or at least not the real me. Just the idea of me she'd constructed in her head. Was that her fault or mine? I'd hidden my wealth, tested her loyalty, set up conditions that made genuine connection almost impossible. Maybe if I'd been honest from the beginning, things would have been different, or maybe not. Maybe Colette had always been exactly who she appeared to be, and my test had simply confirmed what would have emerged anyway. I'd never know, and maybe that was the real tragedy. Not the failed marriage, but the uncertainty. The permanent question of what might have been. The Ashford family did not take the settlement gracefully. Harrison called me once, after the papers were signed. Not to apologize, that wasn't in his vocabulary, but to deliver what I assume he thought was a devastating assessment. "You think you've won something here," he said. "You haven't. Money doesn't make you one of us. It doesn't erase where you came from or who you really are. I never wanted to be one of you, Harrison. That was your daughter's ambition, not mine. My daughter gave you 11 years of her life. Your daughter gave me 11 years of contempt. And I gave her $4 million to make it stop. We're more than even." I hung up before he could respond. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I moved to San Francisco. It wasn't a dramatic relocation. I rented an apartment in Pacific Heights, furnished it simply, began settling into a new routine. But it was a decisive one. I was leaving behind the East Coast, the proximity to the Ashfords, the entire geography of my failed marriage. Leonard's Foundation became my new focus. The Hoffman Education Initiative worked with schools in Oakland, San Jose, and parts of San Francisco, teaching coding and computer science to kids who otherwise wouldn't have access to those resources. The students came from backgrounds like mine, working-class families, immigrant communities, neighborhoods where tech money was visible but completely inaccessible. I started as a technical advisor, helping develop curriculum and training materials. But within a few weeks, I was spending more time in the classrooms themselves, working directly with students. There was a kid named Marcus who reminded me of myself at that age. Quiet, observant, clearly intelligent, but with no obvious path forward. His mother worked 2 jobs. His father wasn't in the picture. The idea of going to college, let alone working in tech, seemed like a fantasy from another world. I made a point of mentoring him specifically, not through grand gestures or obvious charity, but by showing him what was possible, taking him to visit NextGen's offices, introducing him to engineers who'd come from similar backgrounds, demonstrating through example that the path existed even if it wasn't visible. "You could do this," I told him during one of our sessions. "Everything you're seeing here, it's not beyond your reach." "Easy for you to say," he replied. "You probably went to Stanford or something." "I went to community college in Bakersfield. I grew up in a trailer park." He looked at me differently after that. The work was fulfilling in ways my career at NextGen never had been. At NextGen, I'd been solving technical problems. Interesting ones sometimes, but ultimately abstract. The algorithms I developed made companies better at predicting what people would buy. It was profitable, but it wasn't meaningful. Here, I could see the impact. Watch a kid's face light up when their code finally worked. Hear about a student getting accepted to a computer science program they never thought they'd qualify for. Know that I was creating pathways that hadn't existed before. I started donating more seriously. not just to Leonard's foundation, but to scholarship funds, mentorship programs, organizations that helped first-generation students navigate the college process. The money I'd hidden for so long was finally doing something useful, and slowly I began to feel like myself again. Not the version of myself I'd been with Colette, diminished, dismissed, perpetually inadequate. Not the secret millionaire hiding behind a manufactured identity. Just Wyatt Brennan, a person with resources and the desire to use them well. I ran into Marguerite Ashford at a charity gala in Palo Alto. It was April, almost a year after Thanksgiving, and I was attending the event as a donor, one of several supporting a local education initiative. I hadn't expected to see anyone from my former life there, but Marguerite and Tristan had apparently relocated to the Bay Area after Tristan's hedge fund opened a West Coast office. She spotted me across the room and did a visible double-take. For a moment, I thought she might pretend not to recognize me. Instead, she made her way over, champagne glass in hand, expression carefully composed. "Wyatt, I didn't expect to see you here." "Marguerite, how are you?" "Fine. Good." She was studying me, taking in the new suit, the confidence, the evident comfort in this wealthy environment. "You look different." "I feel different. I heard about the settlement. Colette was devastated, you know. She's been staying with our parents, trying to figure out what comes next. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you?" "I am, actually. I don't wish her unhappiness. I just couldn't stay in a marriage that was making us both miserable." Marguerite was quiet for a moment. "Then she really didn't know about the money. All those years she had no idea." "That's correct." "Why? Why would you hide something like that?" "Because I wanted to know if she loved me. The actual me, not the idea of me that came with a portfolio attached." "And you concluded she didn't?" "I concluded that she was never given the chance to find out. Neither of us was honest enough for that." I shrugged. "Maybe it's my fault for setting up the test. Maybe it's her fault for failing it. At this point, the blame doesn't really matter." Marguerite seemed to be processing something. "You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Bitterness, anger, some kind of, I don't know, victory lap. You proved us all wrong, didn't you? You could be gloating. What would be the point? Your family's opinion of me doesn't matter anymore. Colette's opinion doesn't matter anymore." I finished my drink. "The only opinion that matters is my own. And I'm working on being someone I can respect." "And are you? Someone you can respect?" "Getting there. It's a process." She nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. For how we treated you. We were—" She hesitated. "We were awful, actually. All of us." "Yes, you were. I don't expect forgiveness." "Good, because I'm not there yet." I set down my glass. "But I appreciate you saying it. That's more than anyone else in your family has offered." And I walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing alone with her champagne and whatever thoughts my words had stirred. The foundation work expanded over the following year. What had started as a volunteer advisory role became something more substantial. Leonard asked me to join the board, then to help develop a national expansion strategy. We were reaching thousands of students now, with programs in a dozen cities and partnerships with school districts across the country. I found myself traveling constantly, visiting sites, meeting with educators, speaking at conferences about the importance of early tech education for underserved communities. The life I'd lived with Colette, small, quiet, deliberately unremarkable, was gone. In its place was something expansive, purposeful, engaged with the world in ways I'd never imagined. The money helped, obviously. Being able to write significant checks, to fund scholarships and equipment and teacher salaries, made things possible that wouldn't have been otherwise. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the time, the attention, the willingness to show up and do the work. Marcus graduated from high school that spring with a full scholarship to UC Berkeley's computer science program. I was at his graduation ceremony, watching him walk across the stage, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Pride, not in myself, in what we'd built together, in what he'd achieved, in the future that was now possible for him. I dated occasionally during that period, but nothing serious. The divorce had left me cautious, unwilling to open myself to that kind of vulnerability again. I'd learned from the experience with Colette, learned about my own tendency to hide, to test, to hold back the parts of myself that felt too risky to share. But I'd also learned that hiding wasn't sustainable. That real connection required honesty, even when honesty was terrifying. That the relationships worth having were the ones where both people could be fully themselves. I wasn't ready for that yet. Maybe I would be someday. For now, the work was enough. The letter from Colette arrived on a Tuesday in June, almost 2 years after Thanksgiving. I recognized her handwriting on the envelope. Elegant, precise, exactly as I remembered. For a moment, I considered throwing it away unread. Whatever she had to say, it couldn't change anything that had happened. But curiosity won. I opened it. Wyatt, I've started this letter a dozen times, never knowing what to say. There's no version of this that makes me look good, so I've decided to stop trying. You were right. About me, about my family, about what our marriage really was. I didn't see it at the time. I was too defensive, too angry, too humiliated to acknowledge the truth. But I see it now. You tested me, and I failed. Not because you hid your wealth, but because my treatment of you was conditional on what I thought you could provide. When I believed you had nothing to offer, I gave you nothing in return. That's not love. That's not even decent partnership. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not even sure I'm asking for it. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. What I did, who I was. I'm in therapy, working on myself, trying to understand how I became someone capable of treating another person so badly. It's uncomfortable work. Looking at yourself honestly when you don't like what you see. But I suspect you already know about that kind of discomfort. I hope you're happy. Not because I deserve to wish you well, I don't, but because everyone deserves happiness, even the people we've hurt. And I hurt you deeply, for years, without ever recognizing what I was doing. I'm sorry. Those words feel inadequate, but they're all I have. Colette, I read the letter 3 times. Then I sat with it for a long while, trying to understand what I felt. Not vindication. The desire for that had faded long ago. Not anger. That had faded too. What I felt was something more like recognition. She was describing a version of herself that I'd glimpsed at Thanksgiving, when the contempt had finally become undeniable. She was acknowledging what I'd suspected all along. And she was doing the work. Not for me, we were long past that, but for herself. I didn't respond to the letter. There wasn't anything left to say, but I kept it, a reminder of what had been and what I'd moved beyond. I met Joanna at a conference in Boston. She was a social entrepreneur, running a non-profit that trained women from low-income backgrounds for careers in technology. Our organizations had complementary missions. We'd been introduced by a mutual colleague who thought we should explore a partnership. That first conversation lasted 4 hours. Joanna was brilliant, driven, passionate about her work in ways that reminded me of the best version of myself. She'd grown up in foster care, worked her way through college on scholarships and side jobs, built her non-profit from nothing into a major force in the workforce development space. She also had no interest in my money. I know who you are, she said early in our conversation. I know about NextGen, about the sale, about all of it, and I want to be clear. If we work together, it's because our missions align, not because you can write big checks. I appreciate that. I'm serious. I've dealt with wealthy donors who think their money buys them control. That's not how I operate. It's not how I operate either. She studied me for a moment, assessing. Leonard says you're genuine, that you actually care about this work, not just about the tax deductions. Leonard knows me pretty well. Then let's talk about how we can help each other. The partnership was professional at first. We collaborated on joint programs, shared resources and best practices, presented together at conferences. Our work was compatible in ways that created real synergies. Her focus on workforce development complemented our educational programs, creating a pipeline from early learning to career placement. But somewhere along the way, the connection became something more. It wasn't dramatic, No lightning bolt moment, no sudden realization, just a gradual deepening of respect and affection, a growing awareness that the person I most wanted to talk to, most wanted to share things with, was Joanna. I was cautious. After Colette, I'd built walls around myself that weren't easy to dismantle. I worried that my wealth would complicate things, that the power differential would create the same dynamics that had poisoned my marriage. But Joanna wasn't Colette. She had her own success, her own resources, her own identity that didn't depend on me for definition. When she looked at me, she saw a partner, someone to build things with, not someone to extract value from. We started dating a year after we met. It felt different from anything I'd experienced before. Honest, balanced, based on mutual respect rather than unspoken conditions. "I need to tell you something," I said early in our relationship. "You're worth $28 million, and you hid it from your ex-wife for 11 years. I know how." I did my research. When we first started working together, I looked into your background. The divorce settlement is public record. And that doesn't bother you? What bothers me is that you thought you needed to test her, that you were so afraid of being used that you couldn't be honest about who you were. She took my hand. "I don't need to be tested, Wyatt. I know who I am and what I want. If that's not enough assurance for you, we should probably figure that out now." "It's enough," I said. "More than enough." 5 years after Thanksgiving, I stood on a stage in San Jose, watching Marcus deliver a keynote speech. He was 23 now, a software engineer at a startup, a success story that embodied everything we'd hoped the foundation could achieve. He spoke about his journey, from the Oakland neighborhood where he'd grown up, through the coding classes that had changed his trajectory, to the career he was building in Silicon Valley. "I used to think this world wasn't for people like me," he said. "That tech was for kids who grew up with computers in their bedrooms and parents who could afford tutors. But someone showed me that wasn't true, that the path existed, even if it wasn't visible, that all I needed was someone to point the way." He looked at me in the audience. I saw tears in his eyes and felt them in my own. "Thank you," he said, "to everyone who believed in me before I believed in myself." After the event, Joanna found me in the lobby. "You okay?" "Better than okay." I pulled her close. "This is what it was supposed to be for." "What?" "The money, the success, all of it." I gestured at the room around us, the students and educators and donors who'd gathered to celebrate what we'd built. "Not for buying things or impressing people. For this, for making things possible that wouldn't be possible otherwise." "You're getting philosophical in your old age." "I'm getting clear. There's a difference." She kissed me. "Then let's go home. We have a lot more clarity to work on." Home was a house in Palo Alto now, bigger than the Stamford place, but not ostentatiously so. Joanna and I had bought it together, a joint decision that symbolized the partnership we were building. Our daughter, Eliza, was 2 years old. She had Joanna's eyes and my stubbornness, and she was the center of a universe I hadn't known I wanted until I had it. I still thought about Colette sometimes, not with anger or regret, just with the distant recognition of someone you once knew who became a stranger. She'd remarried, I'd heard. A financier from Boston. I hoped she was happy, genuinely hoped it, though I knew nothing about her life anymore. The Ashfords had faded into irrelevance. Harrison had died the previous year. I'd read about it in the Times, felt a brief pang of something that wasn't quite grief, and moved on. Whatever power they'd held over me had dissipated long ago. My life now was full in ways I couldn't have imagined when I was sitting at their Thanksgiving table, absorbing their contempt, hiding the wealth that would have changed everything. Changed it for the worse, I now understood. If I'd revealed the money then, Colette would have stayed, not because she loved me, but because she loved what I could provide. We'd still be together, probably, trapped in a marriage built on conditions neither of us had acknowledged. Sometimes the worst thing someone can do for you is the best thing. Colette telling me to live in the streets had been cruel, humiliating, devastating. It had also been liberating. That night, after Eliza was asleep and Joanna was reading in the study, I stepped onto our back deck and looked up at the stars. 5 years ago, I'd been a man hiding from his own success, trapped in a marriage that required him to be less than he was. I'd spent more than a decade pretending to be ordinary, testing a wife who couldn't pass the simplest test of genuine love. Now, I was something different. A husband to someone who saw me clearly and chose me anyway. A father to a child who would grow up knowing her worth wasn't determined by her bank account. A philanthropist, helping kids like I'd been find paths that hadn't existed for me. Colette had told me to go live in the streets. Instead, I'd built a home. Not the physical structure, though that was nice, but the life inside it. The relationships, the purpose, the sense of belonging to something larger than myself. The streets she'd sent me to had led somewhere she never expected, somewhere better. Joanna came out to join me, wrapping her arms around my waist from behind. "What are you thinking about?" "Thanksgiving. The one 5 years ago? The one that changed everything." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you ever regret it? The way things happened?" "I regret the years I wasted. The hiding, the testing, the fear." I turned to face her. "But I don't regret where it led. How could I? You couldn't have gotten here without going through that." "No, I couldn't have." I kissed her forehead. "The hell she sent me to turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me." "That's very philosophical." "I told you. I'm getting clear." She laughed, and the sound carried across our backyard into the California night. I thought about the trailer park in Bakersfield, about the community college classes I'd scraped together, about the startup that became a fortune, the marriage that became a prison, the woman who'd set me free without meaning to. All of it had led here, to this house, this woman, this life. The streets Colette had sent me to hadn't been punishment. They'd been a path, and I was grateful finally for every step.